Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Time for a story. So a couple of weeks ago I was on my way back home after taking the car out for a spin, and I decided that I should stop off and get some petrol. So there was a BP garage on the way. It wasn't a garage that I know, but it was convenient and I decided to fill up there. Now I've decided that I'm going to start using premium fuel in my car. The reasons really are, I could make a whole another video about this, but essentially the UK has decided that in 2021 they're going to start using E10 fuels for regular petrol, and that means that there's a 10% ethanol content in the fuel. Most modern engines will run fine on 10% ethanol. However, the Mark 1 MX-5 engine is not on the list of officially supported engines according to Mazda. Now, I know in the US they've been using E10 fuel for quite a while, and there's plenty of Miatas there and they all run fine. So most probably it wouldn't be an issue. But since I don't use the car very much and, you know, the cost is not really that important, I decided that it would be better just to use premium fuel from now on, seeing as that doesn't have the 10% ethanol content. So therefore I decided I was going to fill up with BP Ultimate, which is BP's premium fuel. So I pulled up to the pump, found the BP Ultimate nozzle, stuck it into the filler, and off I went. And that is when I looked up and discovered that I was actually filling up with BP Ultimate Diesel. Yes, feel free to have a good old laugh at my expense. But I will say this, it is surprisingly easy to do this. I consider myself to be a bit of a car enthusiast, you know, I take care of my cars, and I never considered that I would be someone who would be stupid enough to put the wrong fuel in their car. You know, it's the kind of story that you hear from your mate Dave down the road who borrowed their friend's diesel Golf and then accidentally filled it up with petrol because he didn't know any better. But in this particular case, and I'm not making excuses here, it was a very stupid thing to do, I should have been paying more attention, but there were a few factors which led to this being easier than it should have. The first is that the logo that they use for BP Ultimate petrol and diesel is exactly the same for both. The only difference is that the diesel is on a dark blue background and the petrol is on a light blue background. But there's nothing in the actual logo that says diesel or petrol. There is a little sign above the logo that states that, and of course if I'd been looking properly I should have seen that. But I just walked up to the pump and I saw BP Ultimate, picked up the nozzle and chucked it in. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing, which is a bit of a weird one, is that I shouldn't have been able to put the fuel filler nozzle into the fuel filler hole, because diesel nozzles are not supposed to fit into a petrol filler. And I don't know if this is something that's unique to my Japanese spec Unos Roadster, or whether this is something which is common to all MX-5s. But in this case, the nozzle went into the filler absolutely fine. I didn't have any problems getting it in, and there was nothing to alert me to the fact that I was about to put in the wrong fuel. So let that be a warning to you. Even if you think you are someone who could never do something as stupid as this, trust me, it's a lot easier than you might imagine. Thankfully, I realized pretty quickly, I hadn't put very much fuel in. I put in about 4 liters. Which the MX-5 has a 45 litre tank, so 4 litres is around about 8%. So I had to decide what to do next, and seeing as I needed to just get home, I decided to just brim the tank with petrol and just hope for the best. And actually, everything was fine. I didn't notice any rough running, the car wasn't struggling. Performance was pretty much exactly the same as I would have expected. The only thing I did notice is as I was pulling into the garage, I did notice quite a strong smell. It didn't really smell like diesel, it smelled more like jet fuel. You know, when you get out of the back of a jet onto the runway and you get that smell. Which kind of makes sense because diesel and jet fuel are actually quite similar. So when I got home, I then did a little bit of research, and what I discovered is that the general consensus is if you have up to about 5% contamination of either petrol in diesel or diesel in petrol, that's normally considered to be within the limits of what the engine would be able to tolerate. And in this case, you could basically just brim the tank with petrol, and then as you drive, you can just keep topping it up with petrol, and that will gradually reduce the ratio of diesel to petrol in your tank. Between 5% and 10% is considered to be a bit of a grey area. Depends on your engine really. So more finely tuned engines obviously are going to be less tolerant to the wrong kind of fuel. Older engines or less technologically advanced engines are likely to be able to tolerate a bit more. But generally 10% is considered to be the upper limit of the contamination that you can expect to be okay when you drive the car. So as I mentioned earlier, in my case, it was around about 8% contamination. And initially I thought I might just leave it and just basically just drive the car and keep topping it up with petrol. But the more I thought about it, the more I just thought that that was just not the right thing to do. First of all, it's a pain in the ass because every time you take the car out, you've then got to factor in going to a petrol station and topping it up. And then secondly, the damage to the engine itself is not the only thing you have to worry about. So diesel and petrol burn very differently, and if you've ever tried to light diesel on fire, you'll know that it actually doesn't want to burn. You have to vaporize it first before it actually even does catch on fire. There's a really good video about this actually, which I saw, which I'll link to in the description, where a guy basically tries a whole bunch of different fuels and shows the difference. Petrol obviously vaporizes very easily and the vapor burns very efficiently, and that is why petrol is so flammable. So petrol in an engine, when you inject that petrol in, you light it with a spark, it's going to burn, most of it's going to burn off cleanly, and then the exhaust is going to be ejected. When you inject diesel into the same cylinder, that diesel is actually not going to burn properly. What's going to happen is it's going to just cook, essentially. And that will leave a kind of a deposit, sort of a slimy, tarry deposit that will get all over the inside of the engine, all over the spark plug, all over the piston, all over the valves. And some of it will then be ejected into the exhaust system, where it will then get all over the O2 sensor, and some of it will then get into the catalytic converter. And if you get too much diesel in the catalytic converter, the really high temperatures there can actually ignite it, and then you would have a fire inside the catalytic converter, and that just is a complete disaster. Not only that, but you also have to worry about the fuel system. Obviously diesel is a lot heavier and thicker than petrol, and petrol fuel filter is not designed to filter diesel. So you're actually going to end up with stuff stuck in your filter as well. That's going to decrease your performance. Basically, it's just a mess. And the more you drive the car, the more of a mess you're creating. So with that in mind, we now come to the subject of this video, which is how to drain your fuel tank. And thankfully, it's actually quite an easy job to do. There are a couple of ways you can do it. You can either disconnect the fuel line where it goes into the fuel filter and you can siphon the fuel out that way. Or you can use a hand pump and you can put that into the top of the tank and you can suck the fuel out that way. But by far the easiest way is just to undo the fuel drain plug, which is at the bottom of the tank under the rear wheel, and you can just basically drain out the tank. Now, there are a couple of considerations you have to think about if you're going to do this job. The first thing is when you undo the fuel drain plug, there is a little washer on there. The best thing to do is to replace that washer because it might not seal back up properly, and then you're obviously going to have a leaking fuel tank, which is not good. The second thing is you have to consider what you're going to do with the fuel once you've drained it out. Now, of course, an absolute no-no is just to pour it down the drain. If you even are considering doing that, you need to really check yourself because, quite frankly, all you're doing is fucking up your own environment. You know, would you shit in your own bed? I certainly wouldn't. So you've got to dispose of it properly. Some recycling centers will take fuel. My recycling center doesn't. But my council does offer a service where they'll come and pick up various chemicals from you and dispose of them properly. The other thing is you're going to want a suitable receptacle to capture your fuel in. So in my case, I've got hold of these buckets. These buckets have a lid so they can seal. You don't want to be storing fuel in an open container because it will vaporize, and that vapor is of course extremely flammable, and you don't want your entire garage or house or whatever to go up in flames. Right, so the fuel tank drain plug is under the left-hand side of the car. It's a bit dark, but basically it's just up there. So the best thing to do is to take off this wheel to give you a bit more access and get the car jacked up. So one important thing you must never forget to do is to disconnect the battery, and that will prevent any stray sparks from lighting your fuel on fire and consequently your life. Right, so I've removed the wheel and I've got the car jacked up on axle stands, and now you can clearly see the drain plug for the fuel tank there. So unfortunately these large buckets that I got are too tall to fit under the car. So what I'm going to have to do is put the fuel into the smaller bucket and then pour it into this bigger one. You should also open the fuel filler because the whole system is designed to be airtight and it will stop the fuel from draining out properly. Right, so this said it was supposed to be a 14mm, but it's definitely not. Right, moment of truth. This is where things probably get a bit messy. So let's just hope for the best. Oh, there we go. That's cracked it. Interestingly, it doesn't really smell like diesel. There's a bit of a myth that diesel will sink to the bottom of a fuel tank, but actually this smells very much like petrol, not diesel. So I don't think that's the case. I think it will stay mixed. So one thing you can do if you want to limit the amount of fuel coming out is to do up the fuel filler cap again, because then obviously no air can get through the system, and you can actually use it as a bit of a control. If I undo this now, see the fuel comes out much faster, and if I do it up again it'll slow down. What a waste of money. What could be more depressing than that? Right, so I had a feeling we were getting towards the end, so I carefully reconnected the battery again, and I've waited for the fuel gauge to stabilize. And as you can see, we are, well, pretty much on the empty line now, depending on what angle you look at the gauge from. So I think there will be just enough fuel there for me to get down to the petrol station and fill up again. So I'm going to leave it there and do up the nut properly with the washer on it, and then we'll go and fill up with new fuel. So we're going to lose a bit more fuel in the process, but hopefully not too much. That tank sounds pretty damn empty to me. I'm hoping I've left enough. It'd be quite embarrassing to get stuck on the way to the petrol station. And here are my sad little buckets of fuel, the evidence of my dreadful mistake, and about 60 quid's worth of fuel, unfortunately. Right, so there's one other thing left to do, and that is to change the fuel filter again, which is a real shame because I just bought a fuel filter only about 7 months ago. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to drive the car a bit first, just so that the last vestiges of the diesel are pumped through the system, and then I'll change the fuel filter at that point. And that means that any diesel residue that might be in there will be removed. Right, let's just do one last little check for leaks. It's looking nice and dry around there. Unfortunately, the petrol has dissolved the underseal around here. So you can see actually in the presence of petrol, the stuff basically just turns into oil and just gets really sticky. But I don't think petrol tanks are really a major source of rust on an MX-5, so I don't think it's that big of a deal that it's actually got washed off there. I'm also going to take the car and get it topped up with underseal within the next year, hopefully, so this shouldn't matter too much. Right, all done. I filled up with premium fuel and then I took it for a bit of an Italian tune-up, and everything seems to be working fine, so all's well that ends well. All in all, this mistake has cost me close on 150 pounds, including fuel. So be that a lesson to you, always pay attention at the fuel pumps. But anyway, all successful, tank successfully drained, new fuel in, all's good. So that is job done. Chat to you soon.